the COVID pandemic has had a huge impact on people being able to keep their jobs, and some of them simply could not. And so 1.5 million people lost their jobs in this 2-year period of COVID-19. Is that enough, though? We are going to discuss that with my panelists. With that, let's give you a quick run of what's been happening around the country. These are your top stories at 5. The Department of Public Works and Infrastructure has appointed an independent specialist engineering team to assess fire damage to the Parliament buildings. This comes after the building was declared unsafe for occupation. 9 senior officials from the Department of Health and the Department of Infrastructure Development have been placed on precautionary suspension. This after the SIU uncovered a series of irregularities in the awarding of contractors. 3 ANC members have been shot and injured during a branch meeting in Drie Koppies. This is in Mpumalanga. It's believed that they were trying to gain access into a venue when they were shot. And the Higher Education Department Minister, that's Dr. Blade Nzimande, says his department is working on ways to root out corruption within the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. He says government aims to solve the funding crisis. Very good afternoon to you. Let's get straight into this discussion. During his 6th State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa revealed that government will be extending its social relief, I should say, of a distress grant by a further year until at least March 2023. Demand has continued to rise for the 350 Rand monthly disbursement that was initiated to cushion the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it's attracted flack, though, from political parties, some of which believe it was a strategy to buy votes ahead of the local government elections last year. Joining us now to discuss whether a year is enough to help protect the poor from the economic malaise are Dr. or should I say Professor Alex van der Heever. He is from Wits University's School of Governance. We are also joined by Trade Union Federation COSATU's Labour Market Coordinator, Lebogang Molaisi. To both of you, thank you very much for making the time. Dr. van der Heever, thank you very much for your time. Let's just get your reaction first on the extension of this grant.
Well, I think it's important that it has been extended. On the issue of whether 12 months is sufficient, that is not sufficient. Such support should be a permanent construct in South Africa's system of social protection, and the need for it preceded COVID. So COVID just exacerbated it, and government implemented it, always arguing that it would be temporary, but in fact it's always been argued that you need this, and in many countries the equivalent versions of this are offered on a permanent basis, and that is the only way in which you balance out the risks in society.
Yeah. Lebogang Molaisi, Professor van der Heever here is very clear that 12 months is not enough. Where do you stand as a Labour Federation?
Thank you, Colin, and thank you for inviting me onto the show. I definitely agree with the sentiments of the professor in the room. 12 months is definitely not enough. I mean, if we look at how growth has not benefited the poor and the working class in South Africa, we definitely need to put in a mechanism that ensures that, you know, we protect the poor and vulnerable from falling into poverty.
And I like the fact that we're talking to COSATU because you are part of the so-called governing alliance. There is a view, if you looked at the paper that was published by Michael Sachs, you'll remember him from the days of National Treasury, and he's of the view that, look, in part, perhaps we do need to accept that this is, in all probability, part of President Ramaphosa's election campaign, so to speak, not just at ANC level, but to bring the ANC back in 2024. Is that the view within the alliance?
I wouldn't say that. I think we need to put things in context. You know, we are the country with the highest inequality in the world. We are a country with significant levels of unemployment, probably the highest unemployment numbers in the world. In that context, it is an important thing for us to have a conversation around a basic income grant for the long term, regardless of which political power is in power, or regardless of whatever, you know, political discussions there may be. There is a need here that shouldn't be politicized. There are a number of people who are unemployed, and this is because of the structural problems in South Africa. So politics aside, there is a need here, and at some point, the governing party had to respond to the need, especially in the context of weakened, you know, the weakened economy and weakened economic participation post-COVID.
Yeah. Dr. van den Heever, or should I say Professor van den Heever, I'd like you to weigh in on this part about President Ramaphosa possibly enhancing not just his chances at re-election at ANC level, but returning his party in 2024.
Yes, I think there's a part of that which trivializes the need of such a social protection support as a mere political tactic.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a fundamental requirement of society. But we do need to recognize that politics is the way of connecting society to the decisions of government. And to that extent, it should incentivize public representatives to look at the things that matter the most to society, and this is one of them. So, but this is not being, I would not see this as a kind of a political trick or a sort of tactic being introduced for the short term. Yeah. What is clear is that the proposals have had to struggle its way through the ANC. I mean, there's a question as to whether or not the ANC is in fact a left of centre party when we look at just how reluctant they have been to date to actually consider such a proposal.
Yeah.
And you find a very lackluster response from quite a lot of the other political parties.
I've got to put this into context. I keep talking about the paper by Michael Sachs. In fact, what he is talking about is what he says is what appears to be consensus for the basic income grant. So we are still at the level of the social relief of distress grant, which is the 350 rand. As we gravitate towards a discussion about the big, which is the basic income grant, affordability becomes a huge talking point, particularly as we head to the budget speech later this month. How affordable is this 350?
So I chaired an expert panel which included Michael on which investigated the affordability of this grant, both at an entry level as well as at a sort of a final level.
Yeah.
And at the level of the COVID social relief of distress grant, it's affordable, and it's affordable on an indefinite basis as well. And that is important to understand. But if we look at the higher levels, the issue is we do need to look at it on an incremental basis and to look at achieving higher levels over time.
Yeah.
So what we had proposed was that our ultimate target has to be the elimination of income poverty as the goal. And we might not achieve that overnight, but we have to have a sustained implementation path toward that objective. And the social relief of distress grant is an unacceptable level, but it is an affordable starting point. And I think that is an important one. And I expect that in the next 6 months we are going to investigate very fully what is required going forward.
Before I move on to Lebogang, do we know how much it is costing us, the 350?
Well, I think National Treasury has put aside about 40 billion rand for this financial year. It might end up costing a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
It's a demand-driven budget. It depends on eligibility, not a budget as such.
Sure.
But I expect it to go up to levels of about 56 billion rand ultimately at the current level. But remember that this is money that is basically just being restructured within society. It's not essentially a cost as such. It's that instead of higher income people spending that money, lower income people spend the money. So it's really a restructuring of demand and consumption in South Africa, which is a very healthy thing.
Okay, all right. Lebogang, let's come to you. Affordability, where does COSATU stand in the midst of wastage that we have been reporting about, those of us in the media space? When we talk about affordability, it's almost like a swear word, particularly to people who are very poor, because they hear and read about this wastage in government for days on end. Why is it that affordability becomes a question when it comes to helping them out?
That's very true. And I think, it's a disservice to the poor when there are policy measures that are meant to benefit them materially, and the first thing that we throw out the window is a question around affordability. And I think the professor has already explained how this, at an entry level, at the level of the SRD, this grant is actually affordable. It takes a bit of restructuring of the budget here and there, but all it does is it ensures redistribution. So this, instead of, benefiting, middle income earners, we're looking at benefiting the poorest of the poor here. So for now, the question is not around affordability. I think when we progress to the various levels of a grant and, bringing in a substantial BIG, that's when we can start to, throw the numbers around and talk about the issue of affordability. But currently, in its current form, this is affordable. And it brings us to the question of effectively redistributing, income from middle income earners to those that are poor. I think, there's a reason to sometimes feel as though, when we're talking about the needs of the poor, we throw around this question of affordability. And I think it's sometimes done at a disservice, really a disservice of the poor.
Professor, let's talk about the South African economy for a moment. And I'm looking down because I want to speak specifically to part of what came out of this, almost the analysis of where the South African economy is at the moment. And it has been stagnating for at least 10 years. According to Michael Sachs, he says he believes that this kind of stagnation is likely to continue. And he says high long-term interest rates, thanks to junk status, low investment, where, for example, the question would be, where are the pledges, for example, that we have seen that were made around the 3 investment summits that the country has had, if we are to talk about low investment rate into the country? And then the last element is about what he describes as a pedestrian rate of growth, which is entrenched, are his words, in the South African economy.
Yeah, so he definitely tries to paint a very negative picture of the South African economy, and I think what he's trying to do is to send a message to the president that he needs to consider some structural reforms in the economy that would enable higher levels of economic growth. I do not see that those kinds of strategies are in any way undermined by income support as envisaged with the SRD and higher levels of social protection. The question really is what's wrong, what's the diagnosis, what's causing South Africa to have such incredibly poor performance over such a long period, and it's not just the last 10 years, it's the last 20 years. We benefited from temporary booms within the world economy from about 2001. These weren't our high growth that we achieved in that period had nothing to do with anything we were doing properly in South Africa. It had to do with windfall gains that we had from the stimulus in the United States, China, and Europe. And we benefited during that period. We did nothing. But when we did achieve high levels of growth during that period, it's a very interesting thing to note, is we had budget surpluses. The question is, what did we do with them? Well, government gave a lot of those back in tax reductions, through tax rebates, etc., in order to create the impression of a fiscal constraint. I think they were concerned during that period, certainly that very conservative macroeconomic policy period of 2001 to 2007, that people might say, well, now we should be talking about social grants. We should be talking about the expansion of social services and social protection. But the moment you create this artificial fiscal constraint by eliminating the tax revenue through tax giveaways, it looks as though government doesn't have enough money. And this is the kind of thing that's happening now. We're going to have a 200 billion rand surplus, potentially. We will see what the final figures are in the budget speech. And we're talking about here a 40 billion rand expenditure on a 200 billion rand surplus. I think that the issue here is people didn't want to allocate the surpluses and the benefits of any growth to social protection. There's been a tug of war in government, there's been a tug of war within the ANC, and basically apathy within quite a lot of the other political parties, even those who regard themselves as being populist and supposedly left. It's a very interesting sort of context in South Africa, and the debate is quite interesting. But this artificial idea that tax constraints only exist when you try and introduce a grant of this nature, but tax constraints don't exist when you give 100 billion rand handout to people through their retirement benefits in the private sector. You and me and quite a lot of other people are benefiting from tax benefits that go to us as income earners in South Africa. In other words, the working age population. About 130, 140 billion rand a year in tax benefits. And you will not have seen any of those policies discussed against a fiscal constraint. But the moment you talk about social grants, there's a fiscal constraint. So the issue is there's quite below the radar policies that don't require any kind of validation, any kind of evidence. But when you talk about social grants, the evidence bar is set incredibly high. We will, a lot of us looking at this issue, will basically go through and collect and collate and have collated the evidence. But we're not going to accept the fact that a large amount of the government programs can actually be restructured to provide the kind of, to reprioritize the allocations of the state so that we prioritize the people who need it most.
At some point, we're going to have to discuss the culture of dependency. Some people term it differently, but that's at a later stage. Lebogang, let's come to you. I would like to know, and I'm sure many South Africans want to know, how many of these pledges that have been made through the investment summits have been realized into real money?
Yeah, so this is information that's not very forthcoming, right? So at the end of the day, pledges are just that. They're pledges. It's very difficult to tell what of those pledges have actually materialized into actual investment. You know, there are some pockets of investments here and there, but to be quite honest, the realization of the promises of these various investment summits has not happened. To be quite honest with you, we're dealing with a private sector that's unpatriotic. A domestic private sector, that is, that's unpatriotic to South Africa and the South African needs. They've undergone an investment strike. They've sat on their resources and their revenues, and they've chosen not to spend it in the South African economy. They've sat on their reserves. So this is why we have the problems that we have. If we had a private sector that was responsive, if we had a private sector that was willing to build on the South African economy, we probably would have seen the realization of more pledges becoming actual investment into our economy. And we're not seeing that. And we probably need to deal with where we place the private sector in all of these conversations. Because it's their decisions to withhold much needed resources from the South African economy that's placing us in the position that we're placing ourselves in. I often hear the conversations around creating a renewed social compact, but we can't have one. We can't have a social compact when we have a domestic private sector that's unpatriotic to South Africa and chooses to hoard their resources instead of investing it in the South African economy.
I can't believe we're back to this discussion about a protest by the private sector. But let's take a break. When we return, we probably will have a chance to explore that as well. Is that still the discussion? Watching Politics Unscripted, we are discussing the extension of the social relief of distress grant, the 350 rand in simple terms, to The year 2023, in March to be exact, that's what the President said through his State of the Nation address on Thursday. And so we're discussing the implications of that. Professor van den Heever, I'm frankly astounded. Someone will say, and someone who wants to play politics, in fact, will say, but how can we still be talking about a private sector that is refusing to invest in the South African economy when they have in office someone who has been seen as a darling to South African business?
Well, I think that there's a big discussion to be had about the constraints to economic growth and investment in South Africa, because part of this hoarding of investments, as well as the essentially focusing on foreign markets for investment, has been because local conditions have been made high risk and uncertain. And the unrest has created that, the massive levels of corruption, and the introduction of regulatory measures of various kinds that are clearly about political patronage. And those things mean that people don't actually understand how to operate in the South African market and make a proper return. That uncertainty has to end. We've had also huge constraints around Eskom, basic facilities and water, all because of patronage. And all of those hopefully are on the way out, but it takes time. So we've had a lot of negatives. I wouldn't just blame the private sector for this. Government is hugely complicit in the failure to achieve economic growth in South Africa. It has a powerful position in relation to the supply side of the South African economy, and it hasn't actually exploited its capabilities there.
Lebogang, your take on that?
You know, I was listening to the State of the Nation address, and, you know, basically the president is appealing to all sectors and key stakeholders of this economy to come together and agree on a grand pact to make sure that this economy benefits. I don't think the private sector benefits from there being low levels of growth. They too need growth to build their businesses.
Yeah, but what about the responsibility? What about government taking responsibility for the July unrest, for example?
Absolutely.
That creates uncertainty for businesses.
Absolutely. And I think government has done that, hence the reports that we've been seeing rolled out between, you know, the reports detailing what happened with the unrest and the reports detailing, you know, from the Zondo Commission. You know what? Government is starting a process to identify what's gone wrong here. But what do we do in the process? Do we fold our arms and say this is government's problem to fix? I think when we are parties to a social compact, clearly there must be a level of give and take from all sectors of society, and this includes government, this includes the private sector, this includes communities and business.
Sure.
So if we're saying that we're going to hold each other's hand and get out of this quagmire that we face, surely there's a part for all of us to play. We can't just keep on blaming. And there is uncertainties, but the reason why we're entering into a compact is because we're trying to figure our way out in the context of these uncertainties.
Very briefly from your side, I need to come to Alex in a moment. I remember the current Minister of Finance in his capacity as ANC head of economic transformation being very resistant to the idea of the basic income grant, because I think the worry was that you're creating a culture of dependency. And so lump those two questions in one. The basic income grant, where does COSATU stand? Because I suspect that's where we are going with this 350 Rand, but couple that with the question around dependency, creating a culture of dependency.
You know, okay, let me firstly start with this. COSATU is in full support of the introduction of a BIG. That's the first thing. I think, you know, when we raise this question of dependency, again, we trivialize the need for this much needed support to poor income households. We trivialize it and we make it a non-starter conversation because we've linked it directly to this issue of dependency. The reason why people need a basic income grant is because there are no jobs. So what dependency are we talking about? There are structural problems and there are no jobs in this economy. It's either this or people sit in their homes and they starve. And I don't think that's the society that we want to live in. The July unrest tells us that this is an unsustainable situation that we find ourselves in. The high levels of unemployment in this country are unsustainable. So this whole talk around dependency, really, it's meant to trivialize the discussion around the BIG. You know, there are a lot of us working individuals who receive tax rebates that professors already talked about. And nobody talks about how that creates a culture of dependency on tax rebates. So I feel that when we talk about the poor, we always have these negative connotations and negative terms that we throw into the discussion. And I think this discussion around a culture of dependency also does that. And this is what takes us back when we try to implement, you know, social policy that will mean something, substantively, materially change the lives of the poor.
Yeah. Alex, your last thoughts on these two elements?
Yeah, so the idea of what is called syndromic dependency, because you've got a child who's dependent on parents, the non-working parent dependent on the income of the other parent. You've got all sorts of dependency that exist all the time. What we have here is a situation where people regard certain people as being undeserving poor. That's the working poor. And that really is something that's a mindset that has existed for hundreds of years. You will find it. It's one that has been overturned, for instance, in Europe, in the sort of post-war consensus on social protection reform through all countries. Where you're dealing with structural barriers to accessing parts of society or employment, you cannot blame that person for not working. So what you want to do is enable that person to get back into employment or to participate, socially participate. An absence of income is a fundamental form of social exclusion. You are completely barred from anything. You can't transport, you can't look for work, you can't invest, you can't save, nothing. And that's what you have to end. So because, just to make a comment on the Minister of Finance, and I'm going to be rather disparaging here, in our expert report that we've got, we have documented the evidence in relation to dependency. There is no evidence whatsoever that grants of this value and this level create dependency of any form. What is shown is that people, it's important to understand, low-income people are incredibly careful about how they spend their money. And you see it coming out in the statistics. It goes to the basics. So if you double the amount that is going into low-income households, they'll double the amount spent on transport, food, housing. That's the kind of things they spend their money on. That's not what I necessarily spend on, but that's what low-income groups spend on. They're not spending it on drink or liquor or beverages, sitting on the corner sleeping. And the evidence shows that it enables participation back into society. No evidence of a disabling effect on employment. So if the Minister of Finance reads, he should go read the report instead of just going on his gut or on the advice of some, I'm afraid, largely uneducated officials in his department. There does have to be an informed discussion, and it does have to be on the evidence, not on what people's beliefs are.
Professor Alex van den Heever, thank you very much for your contributions to this discussion. He is from the Wits School of Governance and Trade Union Federation COSATU's Labour Market Coordinator, Lebogang Molaisi. Thank you very much for your contribution as well.